The mountains of Fars awaken so slowly that, if you were to stand among them before dawn, you might believe that they had never slept at all. Their ridges rise from the earth in long, weathered folds, their stone faces worn smooth in one place and fractured in two, jagged cliffs in another, as though countless ages have patiently carved them without ever reaching an ending. Before the first light reaches the highest peaks, the valleys remain wrapped in cool shadow. The air is still. Even the smallest sounds seem to linger longer than they should, carried gently across empty distances where no walls interrupt the wind. Somewhere among the rocks, a single bird calls into the darkness, and then all becomes quiet again, leaving only the whisper of the breeze as it wanders through wild grasses that cling stubbornly to the thin mountain soil. Here, long before emperors imagined themselves masters of continents, the world was measured not by borders drawn across maps, but by the rhythm of the seasons. Spring arrived quietly, coaxing pale green shoots from the earth after winter rains had softened the valleys. Shepherds led their flocks along narrow trails remembered by generations before them, moving with deliberate patience from one grazing ground to the next. Every path had a story. Every spring, hidden among the rocks, carried the memory of ancestors who had paused there centuries earlier. Time did not rush in these highlands. It unfolded as gently as the morning mist lifting from the valleys, revealing familiar slopes that seemed almost unchanged from one lifetime to another. As daylight spread across the mountains, the colors deepened. Gray stone became warm bronze beneath the rising sun. Sparse shrubs released the faint scent of sage and thyme, where their leaves had been brushed by passing sheep. Small flowers appeared in sheltered places where precious moisture lingered, adding brief touches of violet, white, and yellow before the long summer heat would claim them once again. The wind carried these delicate fragrances over the hills, mixing them with the earthy smell of wool, leather, smoke, and dust. Together, they formed the quiet perfume of a land that asked much from those who lived upon it, yet offered a quiet strength in return. The people who wandered these mountains possessed little that distant kingdoms would have envied. Their homes were woven tents of wool and goat hair, carefully pitched where pasture and water could be found. Their wealth walked upon four legs. Sheep, goats, horses, and cattle were their companions, their livelihood, and their inheritance. Every morning began before sunrise, when glowing embers were stirred back into flame and simple. Meals were prepared, while the eastern horizon slowly brightened. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. They learned to recognize the distant shape of gathering clouds, the call of mountain birds, and the hidden dangers of narrow passes. Wisdom came not from written scrolls, but from patient observation, repeated through countless seasons. When evening returned, bringing cooler air down from the higher ridges, the camps settled into a peaceful rhythm. Fires flickered gently against the darkness, sending tiny sparks upward toward a sky crowded with stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a luminous river flowing silently across eternity. Elders spoke softly, while younger listeners gathered near the warmth. Their stories wandered through memory rather than certainty, recalling ancient heroes whose names had survived longer than the kingdoms they had challenged. They spoke of courage, loyalty, and justice, of promises kept beneath open skies, and of leaders who remembered that a ruler's first duty was to protect those who trusted him. Among these stories lived the distant memory of a man called Achaemenes. History remembers little with certainty about him. Yet, memory does not always require certainty to endure. Around countless fires, his name became more than that of a single ancestor. It became the beginning of a lineage, a quiet root from which future generations believed their strength had grown. Whether shepherd or noble, warrior or elder, those who claimed descent from him carried an idea that reached beyond blood alone, that even among rugged mountains and scattered tribes, destiny could rest patiently beneath ordinary lives, waiting for the season in which it would finally awaken. The mountains listened without reply. They had watched generations arrive and disappear, like drifting clouds across their peaks. Beyond the quiet folds of the mountains, beyond the lonely valleys, where shepherds measured their lives by the changing seasons and the patient movement of their flocks, another world stretched across the horizon. It was a world of walls instead of open skies, of crowded streets instead of winding goat paths, of kings whose voices echoed through great halls of carved stone, rather than across campfires beneath the stars. The travelers who occasionally returned from distant lands carried stories that seemed almost impossible to imagine. They spoke of cities so vast that a person could walk from sunrise until evening and still remain within their walls. They described gates covered in polished bronze that reflected the morning, light like pools of liquid fire, temples whose stairways climbed toward the heavens in slow and solemn layers, and markets where countless languages blended together into one endless murmur that never truly fell silent. To those who remained in farce, these places existed almost like dreams. They belonged to another rhythm of life, another way of understanding the world. Yet the mountains were never entirely isolated. Caravans passed through distant valleys, carrying lapis from the east, cedar from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, fragrant oils, woven cloth, precious stones, and stories gathered from every corner of the ancient world. Every traveler added another thread to an ever-growing tapestry of distant kingdoms whose rulers believed themselves chosen by heaven itself. For many generations, one mighty kingdom had risen only to disappear beneath another. The Assyrians had once marched with terrifying certainty. Their armies moved like storms across the plains, disciplined beneath banners that cast long shadows upon the earth. They built cities whose walls appeared almost inseparable from the horizon itself, and they filled their palaces with carved reliefs, showing endless victories, endless hunts, endless triumphs over enemies who seemed destined to fall before them. Stone lions guarded broad entrances, polished smooth by countless footsteps. Towering gates watched silently over roads worn by merchants, soldiers and prisoners alike. Yet even such overwhelming strength could not outlast time. Winds continued to blow across abandoned courtyards. Rain settled into cracked foundations. Grass slowly emerged between broken stones, where kings had once proclaimed themselves eternal. Then Babylon rose once more. The city rested beside the slow waters of the Euphrates, like something imagined before it was ever constructed. Its enormous walls stretched across the plain with such confidence that later generations could scarcely believe the descriptions. Preserved by ancient writers, layer upon layer of sun-dried brick formed, barriers so wide that chariots could pass along their tops. Great towers interrupted their long lines, watching patiently across fields that shimmered beneath the heat of summer afternoons. The famous gates stood, adorned with deep blue glazed bricks that seemed almost to capture pieces of the sky itself. Upon them marched lions, dragons, and mighty bulls, their golden forms glowing whenever sunlight reached them. Travelers approaching from distant roads first saw only a faint outline rising from the shimmering horizon. Then, hour after hour, the walls grew larger until they seemed less like human construction and more like another range of mountains lifted from the plain. Within those walls, life unfolded without pause. Potters shaped clay beneath practiced hands. Scribes pressed careful marks into damp tablets, while the scent of fresh reeds lingered in the air. Priests climbed temple stairways before dawn, carrying offerings toward sanctuaries where lamps burned with unwavering light. Merchants unfolded fabrics, dyed in colors unknown among the mountain tribes. Bakers filled narrow streets with the comforting fragrance of warm bread. Northward, the Medes ruled from their own highlands, commanding an empire built not only through conquest, but through careful alliances between noble families whose loyalty was constantly renewed, questioned, and strengthened again. Their authority reached into many lands, including the quiet valleys where the Persian clans continued their familiar lives. Tribute was expected, herds were counted, gifts were offered. Local rulers acknowledged the supremacy of the Median king. Yet beneath these formal obligations, the Persians remained themselves. Their language continued to be spoken beside evening fires. Their songs drifted through mountain passes exactly as they always had. Children still learned the names of springs before the names of kings. The mountains accepted foreign rule with the same patient silence with which they accepted rain or drought. Dynasties arrived and departed, but stone endured. Years settled gently upon the land. One generation became another, almost without noticing the change. Infants who once slept beside woven tents became shepherds, guiding their own flocks across familiar slopes. Elders who had once ridden proudly through narrow passes now watched quietly beside campfires, their faces marked by sun, wind, and memory. Nothing appeared hurried. Even history itself seemed content to breathe slowly, allowing decades to pass like drifting clouds across the peaks. Yet beneath that calm surface, something almost impossible to measure had begun to gather. It could not be seen in the shape of the mountains or heard in the whispering wind. It existed instead in expectation, in the subtle feeling that the world had entered one of those rare moments when countless separate lives unknowingly moved toward the same distant point. Court astrologers watched unfamiliar patterns among the stars. Priests interpreted dreams whose meanings refused simple explanation. Years settled gently upon the land. One generation became another, almost without noticing the change. Infants who once slept beside woven tents became shepherds, guiding their own flocks across familiar slopes. Elders who had once ridden proudly through narrow passes now watched quietly beside campfires, their faces marked by sun, wind, and memory. Nothing appeared hurried. Even history itself seemed content to breathe slowly, allowing decades to pass like drifting clouds across the peaks. Yet, beneath that calm surface, something almost impossible to measure had begun to gather. It could not be seen in the shape of the mountains or heard in the whispering wind. It existed instead in expectation, in the subtle feeling that the world had entered one of those rare moments when countless separate lives unknowingly moved toward the same distant point. Court astrologers watched unfamiliar patterns among the stars. Priests interpreted dreams whose meanings refused simple explanation. Travelers repeated quiet rumors heard in distant palaces, each story changing slightly, with every telling until certainty dissolved into mystery. Somewhere beyond the certainty of ordinary days, the future seemed to pause, as though taking one long, patient breath before speaking. In one household, descended from the ancient line, remembered around so many campfires, preparations were made for the birth of a child. No mountain shifted, no thunder echoed across the valleys. The shepherds still led their animals toward fresh pasture. Smoke still rose gently into the evening air. The stars returned above fars with their timeless brilliance. Yet history, so often hidden within moments that appear completely ordinary, was already turning with quiet determination toward a name that future generations would remember simply as Cyrus, the child who would one day be remembered across continents. First knew a far smaller world, one measured not by the distance between kingdoms, but by the familiar outlines of mountains that surrounded every horizon. Morning after morning, as pale light spilled gently across the highlands of Fos, Cyrus walked the same winding paths that countless shepherds had followed before him. Loose stones shifted beneath his sandals with soft, patient sounds. Cool air descended from the higher ridges before the warmth of the sun slowly claimed the valleys below. Every season revealed another quiet lesson. Spring painted the slopes with brief colors that faded almost as soon as they appeared. Summer taught endurance beneath endless skies of brilliant blue. Autumn carried the scent of drying grasses, while winter wrapped the peaks in snow, whose silence seemed deeper than any spoken word. Those who watched the young prince noticed little that appeared extraordinary. He rode with confidence, but without pride. He listened more often than he spoke. When elders gathered beside evening fires, their faces glowing softly beneath drifting sparks, he settled among them without impatience, allowing old voices to wander through. Stories whose beginnings had long since disappeared into memory. They spoke of forgotten migrations across distant lands, of winters harsher than any living person could recall, of promises sworn beneath stars that had watched over generations beyond counting. They spoke of Achaemenes, whose name still lingered like the fading echo of an ancient song, and of the quiet dignity required to lead people, whose freedom depended less upon wealth than upon mutual trust. Cyrus listened without interruption, absorbing not only the stories themselves, but the long pauses between them, where wisdom often rested more comfortably than words. Sometimes he climbed alone above the grazing lands, until the camps became little more than scattered points of dark wool against the earth. From those heights, he watched sunlight move slowly across distant valleys, revealing one ridge after another with unhurried certainty. Eagles circled upon invisible currents of warm air. Tiny streams glittered briefly before disappearing beneath stone. Far beyond the familiar mountains, hidden behind shimmering horizons, lay the kingdoms whose names had become woven into every tale carried home by merchants and travelers. He imagined walls rising from endless plains, rivers broad enough to swallow entire caravans, temples whose stairways vanished into the sky. Yet each time, his thoughts wandered outward. The mountain wind gently returned them to the present, carrying with it the scents of thyme, crushed beneath wandering sheep, dry earth warmed through the afternoon, horse leather softened by years of careful use, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke rising from evening fires below. The horses themselves became quiet teachers, patient animals with broad chests and watchful eyes. They knew the mountain trails almost as well as the shepherds who guided them. Cyrus learned to recognize the changing rhythm of their hooves long before he considered the rhythm of armies. On dry ground, their steps produced a steady, hollow music that echoed gently between the hills. Upon loose gravel, the sounds softened into countless, tiny whispers as stones rolled beneath iron shoes during the cool hours before dawn. When dew still rested upon sparse grasses, even the breathing of the horses seemed louder than their footsteps. Their warmth drifted gently into the cold morning air, rising like pale clouds before vanishing into the light. Years passed with such gentleness that they scarcely announced their arrival or departure. The boy gradually became a young man. The youthful curiosity that had once led him simply to ask questions slowly transformed into something quieter and more enduring. He observed disagreements among clan leaders without rushing to speak. He watched how pride could wound friendships that had survived decades, and how patient words offered it precisely. The right moment could restore peace more effectively than threats ever could. he discovered that strength often appeared most clearly in restraint, and that a leader who listened carefully could hear fears that remained invisible to those who sought only obedience. The Persian clans, though united by language, memory, and kinship, remained fiercely independent in their daily lives. Each valley possessed its own respected elders. Each family guarded traditions, carried through generations. No command spread quickly across such country, for every decision traveled upon horseback through narrow passes where conversations unfolded slowly, beneath open skies rather than within crowded courts. Cyrus visited these scattered communities one after another, never hurrying his journeys. He accepted their bread, drank from their springs, admired their horses, and sat beside their fires until strangers gradually became companions. The old men studied him through eyes shaped by many winters. Women preparing simple meals listened quietly while pretending not to notice each conversation. Children followed at a distance, curious about the prince, whose manner resembled that of an ordinary traveler more than a distant ruler. Respect gathered around him, almost unnoticed, like snow accumulating upon the highest ridges through many silent nights. It was not demanded. It arrived because promises were remembered. Disputes, settled fairly, remained settled. Gratitude quietly replaced suspicion. One clan spoke well of him to another, and then another did the same, until stories of his character began traveling farther than he did himself. Yet beyond the mountains, the world refused to remain still. The court of Astyages, mighty king of the Medes, glittered with ceremony while unseen. Fractures slowly spread beneath its polished surface. Noble families measured one another with cautious eyes. Messengers rode tirelessly along dusty roads, carrying sealed commands, whose consequences reached valleys they had never seen. Rumors drifted southward like distant thunder carried upon changing winds. Some dismissed them as nothing more than restless gossip. Others listened more carefully. When darkness settled across, Faz and the stars emerged one by one in astonishing numbers. Quieter journeys began. Riders departed their camps without fanfare, their horses wrapped in dark cloth where leather might otherwise creak too loudly. They followed forgotten tracks between hills, crossed shallow streams whose waters reflected the constellations, and arrived at hidden places where small fires burned low, enough to escape distant notice. Around those modest circles of light gathered men whose faces carried equal measures of caution and resolve. No voices were raised. No dramatic speeches disturbed the sleeping valleys. Instead, there were long silences, broken only by the crackle of juniper branches feeding the flames, or the soft movement of horses grazing patiently nearby. Hands weathered by years of labor rested upon worn knees. Eyes reflected tiny sparks while thoughtful conversations unfolded with deliberate care. Each clan leader spoke not only for himself, but for generations who had entrusted him with their memory. They discussed tribute that grew heavier with each passing season. Distant rulers who understood little of mountain life and the fragile balance between patience and surrender. When agreements were finally reached, they were sealed, not through elaborate ceremony, but through gestures whose simplicity carried immeasurable weight. Hands clasped firmly, cups passed slowly from one elder to another. Ancient words, repeated countless times before entirely different gatherings, drifted upward beneath the endless sky. Above them, the stars remained unchanged, watching as they had watched. Every oath spoken since human voices first echoed. Through those mountains, the nights grew colder as months slipped quietly onward. Thin mist settles into the valleys before dawn, wrapping camps in pale silence. Armor was inspected without haste. Leather straps were repaired by careful hands. Iron spearheads received patient attention, beside glowing coals until each edge caught the firelight with quiet certainty. The smell of heated metal mingled with smoke, wool, horse sweat, and damp earth cooling beneath the stars. No army yet marched. No trumpet announced rebellion. Still, the air itself seemed to carry a new and unfamiliar heaviness, as though the mountains had begun listening more closely than ever before, waiting with timeless patience for the first footsteps of history's approaching storm, far beyond the quiet valleys of Fars, where the mountain winds still wandered patiently through narrow, passeth and shepherds, continued their familiar journeys almost unaware that history had begun to shift beneath their feet. Another rhythm was slowly awakening across the broad lands of Media. It did not begin with the clash of weapons or the thunder of charging horses. It began in silence, in the vast stone courtyards of Ecbatana, before the first rays of morning reached the high walls of the royal city. The air remained cool, carrying the lingering scent of night across polished paving stones where generations of kings had walked before dawn, contemplating victories that had not yet been won, and dangers that had not yet revealed themselves. Messengers crossed the city with measured urgency. Their footsteps echoed softly beneath covered passageways, supported by heavy cedar beams darkened through years of smoke and weather. Stable hands moved quietly among long rows of horses, speaking in low voices while fastening leather. Harnesses still cool from the night air. Iron buckles clicked together with patient precision. Straps were tightened, loosened, then tightened once more. Every movement seemed deliberate, unhurried, almost ceremonial, as though the entire kingdom understood that haste belonged to frightened men, while confidence moved with the slow certainty of mountains. As sunrise gradually spread across the eastern sky, its warm light touched countless helmets arranged in careful rows. Bronze and iron awakened together beneath the growing brilliance, each polished surface reflecting fragments of gold into the cool morning air. Spears leaned quietly against walls. Shields rested upon the earth, awaiting familiar hands. Horses stamped gently upon packed ground, their breathing rising in pale clouds that slowly disappeared as the day warmed. Their dark eyes watched everything with calm patience, ears turning toward every distant sound that drifted through the awakening camp. Among those preparing for departure rode Harpagus, a commander whose life had already been shaped by loyalty, disappointment, endurance, and memory. His face revealed little to those who observed him from a distance. Time had taught him that great. Decisions were rarely announced through dramatic gestures. Instead, they arrived quietly, hidden within ordinary mornings, that later generations would remember as the beginning of entirely different worlds. Around him, offices exchanged careful words, while scribes completed final records upon wax tablets. Supplies were counted again and again with almost meditative attention. Water skins were filled until no empty space remained within the leather. Grain, dried fruit, salted meat, spare bowstrings, whetstones, blankets, medicines, and bundles of firewood accumulated beside wagons, whose heavy wooden wheels waited patiently for the long road ahead. Then, almost without announcement, the army began to move. The first sound was scarcely noticeable. A single hoof settled upon dry earth. Another answered, somewhere farther back, the slow creaking of leather. Harnesses blended with the quiet, groan of wooden axles beginning to turn. After many hours of stillness, one column followed another with remarkable discipline. Thousands of sandals and boots found the same steady rhythm until individual footsteps disappeared into one continuous pulse that spread outward. Across the plain, it was not hurried. It possessed the patient inevitability of a river finding its course. Through ancient stone, dust rose almost immediately. At first, it drifted only around the leading ranks, disturbed gently by passing hooves and wheels. Then the growing column stretched farther across the landscape, and the dust itself seemed to awaken into something vast and living. Fine grains lifted from the dry earth with every measured step, suspended briefly within shafts of sunlight before joining immense pale clouds that rolled slowly behind the marching host. From distant hills, the army appeared almost hidden inside its own horizon of dust, moving beneath a veil that softened every outline until men, horses, wagons, and banners became one great flowing shape, crossing the land. Hour followed hour. The rhythm never truly changed. Leather sandals pressed into the earth and rose again. Iron-shod hooves struck stone with quiet certainty. Harness rings touched one another with gentle, metallic whispers. Wagon wheels groaned patiently over uneven ground, each slow rotation carrying the weight of food, weapons, memories, and expectations toward an uncertain future. The soldiers settled into the endless cadence that every long march eventually creates. Conversation faded until only brief exchanges remained. Most saved their breath. The taste of dust settled gradually upon every tongue. Lips became dry beneath the relentless sun. Fine grains gathered upon eyelashes, within folded cloth, across polished helmets, and along the edges of carefully maintained shields. Sweat mixed with the dust until both became part of the same familiar layer covering armor, clothing, faces, and hands alike. Occasionally, a breeze swept across the column, lifting the dust higher before allowing it to settle once more with remarkable gentleness. Above them, the sky remained impossibly wide. Its blue silence seemed untouched by the ambitions of kings. Birds crossed overhead without changing their course. Clouds drifted slowly toward distant mountains that appeared no closer by evening than they had at dawn. Morning returned so gradually that many of the soldiers believed they had never truly fallen asleep. The stars faded one by one, surrendering their quiet. Along the eastern horizon, the fires that had glowed warmly through the deepest hours of the night became little more than beds of faintly glowing embers, their last threads of smoke, rising into air so still that each delicate ribbon seemed reluctant to disappear. One after another, men stirred from their blankets, not with excitement. Belts were drawn tight, breaths that drifted briefly through the cold before dissolving into light. The great column resumed its patient movement. Again, the rhythm returned, the soft compression of countless footsteps upon dry earth, the measured breathing of horses, the distant creaking of wagons bearing grain, arrows, water, and all the quiet necessities that sustained an army long before any weapon was raised. Dust rose behind them as faithfully as a shadow. It drifted upward in broad veils that softened the landscape until the horizon itself became uncertain. Hills appeared, only to disappear again behind pale clouds of earth. The rising sun climbed higher, slowly warming every stone, every spear shaft, every iron buckle. The cool freshness of dawn surrendered almost imperceptibly to the familiar weight of approaching heat. Far ahead, beyond wavering curtains of shimmering air, another silence waited. The Persian host had already arrived. They did not fill the plain with restless movement. They did not send riders galloping across the horizon or raise triumphant cries toward the heavens. Instead, they waited with remarkable stillness. Horses stood quietly beside their riders, occasionally lowering their heads toward the sparse grass that clung stubbornly to the hard ground. Shields reflected narrow bands of brilliant sunlight before settling once more into muted bronze. Cloaks stirred gently whenever a wandering breeze crossed the open plain. Cyrus waited among them. Those who stood nearby noticed the absence of haste in every movement he made. His horse shifted its weight from one foreleg to the other, its ears turning toward distant sounds carried across the empty land. Cyrus rested one hand lightly upon the animal's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath its skin, the slow rhythm of breathing, the quiet strength that needed no display. Around him, the leaders of the Persian clans watched the eastern horizon without speaking. Their faces revealed neither confidence nor fear, only the patient concentration of men who understood that history often changed direction during moments that appeared almost motionless. The distance between the two armies grew smaller with every passing hour, yet it closed so gradually that the eye scarcely noticed the change. A distant line became recognizable figures. Figures became riders. Riders became rows of polished helmets flashing beneath the growing brilliance of the afternoon sun. Above both armies, the sky remained cloudless, vast beyond imagination, its endless blue pressing gently upon the earth with the immense stillness of eternity itself. Heat rose from the plain in slow, trembling waves that blurred every outline. The air shimmered above scattered stones until the landscape seemed suspended between reality and dream. Even the mountains, far behind the Persian lines, appeared softer now, their familiar ridges fading into a pale blue haze. The hours lengthened. Sweat gathered quietly beneath helmets. It traced slow paths across weathered faces before disappearing into thick beards or falling silently upon leather collars already darkened by heat, hands resting upon shield grips, adjusted almost absent-mindedly as palms grew warm against polished wood. Tiny droplets formed along the edges of bronze helmets and rolled downward with patient certainty. Metal absorbed the relentless sunlight until every shield carried the day's warmth within its surface, becoming almost an extension of the burning earth itself. They shook their heads from time to time, manes rippling gently in the dry breeze. Their tails swept rhythmically against persistent flies. Occasionally, one stamped a hoof upon the hardened ground, producing a dull sound that seemed strangely loud within the overwhelming silence. Nostrils widened as they drew long breaths scented with dust, leather, distant smoke, and the faint smell of thousands of other horses waiting somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon. Their ears moved constantly, listening for commands that did not yet come. Neither army hurried. Neither wished to become the first to disturb the fragile balance that had settled across the plain. It seemed almost impossible that so many thousands of lives could exist within such extraordinary quiet. Men looked across the narrowing distance and saw reflections of themselves. Riders watched riders. Veterans recognized the posture of experienced soldiers, even among strangers. Sunlight glimmered upon spearheads, belonging equally to both hosts. The same wind lifted the edges of cloaks on either side. The same dust settled gently upon Persian sandals and Median boots without preference or judgment. Somewhere within the Median ranks rode Harpagus. The years rested heavily upon him now, though not as a burden alone. They had become companions, filling his memory with promises made, loyalties tested, injustices endured, and truths that had revealed themselves only through long reflection. Around him, officers maintained careful formation, their expressions disciplined beneath polished helmets. None could fully know the thoughts moving quietly behind his composed face. He watched the Persians. He watched the mountains rising beyond them. He watched Cyrus standing with remarkable stillness beneath the blazing sky. The stories he had heard over recent months returned one after another. They were no longer merely rumors, carried by wandering merchants or whispered conversations. Beneath hidden campfires, before him stood the man around whom those stories had slowly gathered, not surrounded by impossible grandeur, but by ordinary men whose trust appeared deeper than fear itself. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to pause. A banner stirred once, and then became still again. Somewhere, far overhead, an eagle circled patiently upon invisible currents of warm air, untouched by the concerns of kingdoms below. Then, with almost unbearable simplicity, Harpagus allowed his horse to step forward. Only a single pace at first, then another. No trumpet sounded, no command shattered the stillness. The movement spread not through violence, but through recognition. Riders nearest to him watched, in quiet uncertainty, before guiding their own horses after him. One line shifted gently, then another, like water finding a new course across ancient stone. Loyalty began flowing toward an entirely different future. Shields remained lowered, spears stayed upright. The plain that had waited so long for the roar of battle received instead the softer sounds of leather creaking, horses breathing, and careful footsteps crossing the invisible boundary that had divided two worlds. Only moments before, Cyrus did not rush to meet them. He simply remained where he was, calm beneath the immense afternoon sky, as the distance between former enemies slowly disappeared. Around him, the Persian, with the same quiet wonder that accompanies sunrise over familiar mountains. No voice disturbed the sacred stillness. No sword demanded blood. The earth itself seemed to exhale after holding one immeasurably long breath. And beneath the endless heavens, the balance of for one timeless moment, it sounded almost like silence. The road toward Ecbatana seemed different now, though the stones beneath the horses' hooves had not changed. Dust still rose gently beneath each measured step, drifting upward before settling once more upon the patient earth. The wind still crossed the open country with the same quiet determination it had carried for countless generations. Yet, something within the procession had become lighter, not because fewer burdens were carried, but because the burden of uncertainty had slowly begun to dissolve. Men who, only days before, had expected to meet one another beneath the violence of battle, now rode together beneath the same banners, their silence no longer filled with suspicion, but with careful reflection. The rhythm of the march remained unhurried. Leather creaked softly with every movement. Harnessed rings touched with familiar metallic whispers. Horses breathed deeply as they climbed the gradual roads leading toward the ancient Median capital, while above them the sky stretched endlessly, unchanged by the quiet turning of history below. Ecbatana appeared first as a distant suggestion upon the horizon, softened by the shimmering warmth of the afternoon. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, its shape emerged from the wavering light. The hills surrounding the city revealed themselves one after another, and upon them rested the famous circles of walls that generation of travelers had described with admiration. One wall rose behind another, each climbing gently upward around the heart of the city like broad rings embracing a sacred center. Their colors shifted beneath the changing sunlight, sometimes pale, sometimes warm with tones of earth and bronze, sometimes almost glowing beneath the long rays of the descending sun. They did not seem hurried into, existence by human hands, but settled naturally upon the hills, as though they had grown from the land itself through centuries of patient labor. The nearer the combined host approached, the quieter the world seemed to become. Birdsong faded, the wind softened, even the horses lowered their heads slightly, their measured breathing becoming the clearest sound upon the road. Far above, citizens had already gathered upon rooftops, balconies, and quiet terraces overlooking the broad approaches to the city. They watched without speaking. Families stood close together, shaded beneath woven awnings that stirred gently in the afternoon breeze. Children, sensing the unusual gravity of the moment without fully understanding it, remained unusually still beside their parents. Elderly men leaned upon smooth wooden staffs, polished through decades of use. Women shaded their eyes against the brilliant light, while searching the approaching columns for signs of destruction that never appeared. There were no flames rising from distant villages, no fleeing crowds, no smoke carried by the wind, only the slow approach of thousands, of men whose footsteps seemed strangely gentle for an army that had changed the course of kingdoms. Before the great gates the procession paused. The enormous wooden doors, strengthened by iron bands, darkened through many seasons of rain and sunlight, remained closed for several long moments. Their surfaces bore countless marks left by generations that had entered and departed beneath their silent guardianship. Deep grooves had been worn into the threshold by wagon, wheels whose drivers had long since disappeared into memory. Stone blocks surrounding the gateway carried the faint polish, created by centuries of passing hands. No voice demanded surrender. No ram struck the ancient timber. Instead, there came only waiting. The pause itself seemed almost sacred. Those standing upon the walls looked downward. Those waiting below lifted quiet eyes toward the towers. The afternoon drifted gently onward. Then, almost too slowly to notice, the gates began to move. Heavy beams groaned softly within hidden hinges. Iron fittings answered with low, ancient voices. Narrow lines of light appeared between the doors before widening, little by little, until the broad entrance opened toward the waiting road. The sound carried not the violence of conquest, but the deep, patient voice of old wood, remembering every season it had endured. Cyrus did not urge his horse forward at once. He allowed the silence to remain complete. He looked upon the city with calm attention, neither triumphant nor fearful, but thoughtful, as though recognizing. But to all those generations whose quiet labor had raised walls, carved stones, planted orchards, and tended sacred fires through centuries now beyond counting. When at last the procession entered, it did so with remarkable gentleness. The wheels of supply wagons turned with slow familiarity. No houses were disturbed. The markets remained closed, their woven coverings hanging motionless above empty stalls. Cedar wood, wool, and grain stored carefully against future seasons. Water continued to flow through narrow channels beside the streets. The people watched from shaded windows and quiet courtyards. Gradually, they understood what their eyes were showing them. The city had not been taken by destruction. Within the royal residence, the old king, Astyages, waited beneath ceilings, supported by cedar beams that had watched. Age had settled gently upon him. The certainty that once surrounded every royal command had slowly yielded to reflection, as rivers eventually surrender their swift currents upon reaching broad. And when Cyrus entered his presence, there was no cruel celebration. Respect was offered where hatred might easily have appeared. Astyages was permitted to withdraw from power without fear, carrying with him the quiet. Outside, evening settled across Ekbatana. Night gathered among their ridges toward sheltered ground, while small fires awakened. Beneath the darkening sky, empires would continue to rise. Cities would grow rich and fall silent. Yet the mountains would remain. Winter snow would melt into spring streams. Generation after, quietly as footsteps. And if, in some distant age, a traveler were to stand upon those high ridges before dawn, listening to the first whisper of wind moving through the valleys, they might still feel that beneath the immense silence the memory of Persia's first awakening had never entirely faded, but rested peacefully within the mountains themselves, waiting with endless patience beneath the eternal sky.